Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the roundtable. This is the fifth or fourth roundtable organized by our research cluster on computational communication research, and also the roundtable has been supported by the Department of Communication, Media and Communication, and also the Center for Communication Research, financially. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the two distinguished speakers, Dr. Jing Song and Dr. Yu Xu. Mason, it's all yours to introduce the two speakers in a more detailed way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the opening. So as mentioned, this is part of the roundtable series of our computational communication cluster. So today we will talk about social network analysis in computational communication. Okay, its opportunities, challenges, and the pitfalls. So today we are so excited to have the two panelists, Dr. Xu and Dr. Jing Song, to join this roundtable discussion. So those two panelists actually are continuously working on network analysis related to research, and frequently appeared on top communication journals, including Communication Research, Journal of Communication, HCR, and the Political Communication. So as usual, firstly, we will have the two presentations, and later we will have a joint Q&A session. So if you have any questions or comments, so you can leave a message in the chat box or ask during the Q&A session. So let me briefly introduce our first presenter, so Dr. Yu Xu, who is currently an assistant professor of integrated marketing communication in the Media School at Northwestern University. So his research interests include media industries, organizational change, social networks, social culture evolution, and the computational social science. Okay, so Dr. Xu, if you're ready, you can start.
Sure. Okay, yeah. And can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me to join this panel and to share my thoughts on opportunities, challenges, and pitfalls of social network analysis. So I attended a summer workshop on computational communication hosted by CityU 7 years ago. So at that time, the Division of Computational Communication Research in ICA was not founded, right? So it's great to reactivate my previous connection with CityU, so which has become a research hub for computational communication research. So my talk today is composed of 4 parts. So I will first provide an overview of the use of social network analysis in communication research. And then I will pay attention to several challenges and pitfalls of using simulation-based network models in communication research. And these models include exponential random graph model and its extension, and also stochastic act-oriented model and relational event modeling. And also network science itself is constantly evolving. So I will also discuss some implications of new network methods and measures for communication research. And in the final part of my talk, I will discuss the roles of communication scholars in computational social science. And I would then use my 2 previous studies to show how to leverage theory-driven computational communication research using network analysis. Okay. So social network analysis has been widely used in computational communication research. And there are 2 major categories, including descriptive and inferential network analysis. So as for descriptive analysis, we see that many scholars have used community detection to assign different individual nodes or individuals to cohesive or structurally equivalent groups. And an extension of this community detection for analyzing relationships among concepts is semantic network analysis, which has components of text mining, word co-occurrence analysis, and clustering analysis. So in these cases, nodes are represented as words, vocabularies, or concepts instead of like individuals or human entities. So they are non-human entities. But the clustering approach to community detection in networks has received some like criticism, like similar to, for example, LDA, topic modeling, or other bottom-up unsupervised like learning approaches. And unlabeled classification results are very hard to interpret. And the number of network clusters is also sensitive to the choice of parameter values. So for example, when we run some like network clustering or modularity analysis, we need to specify a resolution value, right? And a slight change in the resolution value can result in a huge difference in the number of detected communities, right? So in addition, there are also very few goodness of fit statistics that can be used to determine the optimal number of clusters, right? So this is one stream of studies. And another line of research, like from like PR or marketing communication research scholars, have also used like network measures to identify, for example, influencers. And they also use like network metrics to evaluate their performance. Like these metrics include, for example, in degree, betweenness, and eigenvector centrality. So derived from the whole network. Okay. And many communication studies have also used like network measures as dependent or independent variables in inferential analysis, right? So I can say that the most frequently used network metrics include like in degree, betweenness, closeness, and an eigenvector. Like in degree is just the count of incoming ties from other people. So for example, a person is influential because many people seek advice from the person, right? And betweenness serves as the like it shows the ability of a person to serve as bridges, brokers, or intermediaries between disconnected groups or clusters. And closeness shows a low average degree of separation between a person and other network members in the boundary, right? So eigenvector means that a person is influential because the person's friends are well connected and popular in their own community. So different nodes will stand out as being central when different measures are used. However, network members are interdependent because a node's location depends on the location of other nodes, right? So this violates the classical RID assumption, or the assumption of independent and identically distributed random variables of linear regression or conventional statistical techniques. So, but however, we can still see many cases in which these network measures derived from the whole network analysis are used as dependent or independent variables. So despite the methodological limitation, this analytical approach is still widely used by a lot of social scientists. Okay. And as a statistical tool for analyzing interdependent network data, the QAP method is gaining much popularity in communication research, right? So basically, QAP can analyze multiple social relations for the same node set without the RID assumption or the assumption of independent observations, right? So network data are organized in the format of matrices, and we can use QAP to predict the outcome matrix as a function of many predicting or explanatory network matrices. And this method has been applied to build theories of third-level agenda setting, which is an extension of the classical agenda setting theory. And typically, researchers test like correlations between different types of agenda matrices. And another line of research uses QAP to analyze the dynamics of audience overlap. So the dependent variable is the similarity in audience overlap between media outlets. So we can use language, geographic, genre, or ideological similarities as predictors of the outcome matrix, right? So QAP can consider tie strengths, but does not require any assumption of independent observation. But it does not take into account the self-organizing mechanisms of network dynamics, which may result in like biased estimates, right? So this limitation is overcome by simulation-based network models, including ERGOM, stochastic actor-oriented model, also known as Sienna, as well as relational event modeling. So the basic idea of these like simulation-based network models is to take the observed network as a baseline, or we can say starting point, and then run simulations of how a communication or social network would develop or change based on effects of, for example, network self-organizing, nodal attributes, and external relations, right? So in this table, I have listed many simulation-based models, right? So the second row is the valued ergons. It's an extension of traditional ergon, which enables researchers to analyze like weighted networks. And this refinement is very important because if we analyze the weighted and unweighted versions of the same network, some network effects will actually be underestimated or underestimated if tie strength or weight is not considered at all, right? And separable temporal ergon can analyze longitudinal data. So we move from cross-sectional analysis to longitudinal panel analysis, right? So basically, we need to collapse network data into several discrete time points. So the dependent variable here is the probability of tie creation or tie persistence or dissolution, right? As for Siena, it's very similar to separable temporal ergon in the aspect that both methods analyze unweighted binary longitudinal network data. But Siena can also model the co-evolution of behavior and network structure so that we can test hypotheses about behavioral contagion through direct ties over time, right? And multi-level Siena considers interdependence between different types of networks. So it considers both within level and cross-level social ties, right? So in this case, we can find that. So in this case, you can see a multi-level network, which is composed of different node types, right? So in multi-level SAOM, multiple networks with different node types are included simultaneously, right? So it can consider structural interdependence at the higher level. So in this case, we can see some circles. These circles are individual students. And squares are media outlets. So they are non-human entities. So we have both human and non-human entities. And in this multi-level network, we have a one-mode network of friendship among students. So this is a within level network. And there's also a two-mode network between students and media outlets. So this is a cross-level network connections between different node types, right? So in this case, we can use like multi-level SAOM to specify whether there is for example, a stronger tendency for students to establish a friendship based on their common interests in media content, or media consumption is contagious, such that students will be more likely to consume the same media content once a friendship is formed, right? So in conclusion, a multi-level SAOM can inform our classical debate on social influence versus social selection, right? Social selection. Okay. And finally, like relational event modeling has the ability to model time-stamped or sequenced network data without aggregating interactions into a panel, right? So compared to other methods in the table, REM can consider not only tie strength or tie weight, but also the time and sequence of network change, right? So I know that Jonathan has done a lot of research on sequential media and analysis, right? So REM can model the occurrence of relational events over time because our relational data are time-stamped, right? Okay. So basically, there are three types of predictors in simulation-based network models. And the first set of predictors is self-organizing properties that can explain the complexity of social structure, right? So the underlying mechanisms include reciprocity, people tend to exchange their social connections. Preferential attachment, people tend to select those who are already popular in the node. Triadic closure, network brokerage, structural equivalence, recency, and persistence. So they are all network self-organizing mechanisms discussed by network scholars. So these mechanisms are heavily discussed in theories of social networks, right? So our interpretation is that tie change is actually determined by the state of other ties because of network or structural interdependence, right? So our decision of tie change is based on the states of other connections in the same network. Right? And with regard to actor attributes, we can specify, for example, sender, receiver, and homophily effects. So for example, are nodes with certain attributes more likely to receive or same types, right? Or are nodes with similar or dissimilar attributes more likely to have a type, right? After accounting for other self-organizing mechanisms. And the third type of predictors, I say that considers network multiplexity. So basically we use other types of relations among the same set of actors as predictors of the outcome, right? So for example, friendship network can be used as a predictor of advice-seeking network. So in this case, we have two different types of networks, and one network is a predictor and the other is the outcome, right? So they are the three major types of predictors in simulation-based network models. Okay. And in fact, there are many challenges and pitfalls of using these simulation-based network models in communication research, right? So first, researchers should be comfortable with R and Python coding, right? And also the process of model specification and estimation can be very time consuming, right? Which may take 1 hour or even longer to run a single model, which is different from running like traditional regression analysis. And also R squared is unavailable in simulation-based network models. So model fit is typically assessed by higher order goodness of fit statistics, right? But not all empirical communication and social networks will result in good fit or convergent models, right? So in other words, I may not be able to build a model that well captures structural patterns of the observed network. That is entirely possible, right? And also some network models are even non-identifiable, meaning that models cannot be estimated. So no parameter coefficient and standard error will be reported when this issue of model degeneracy occurs. And when this issue occurs or arises, researchers need to move back and forth to find solutions. So for example, we can add some like higher level degree or closure-based parameters, right? Like GWESP, GWDSP, and GWI degree, right? We can also try to reduce network size. And we can also replace like lower order statistics with higher order statistics, right? And the whole process is, I can say, is very time consuming and frustrating, especially when we use like these models for the first time, right? We need to go back and forth. And in addition, the limited number of available parameters in simulation-based network models places many restrictions on what kind of research questions we can propose, right? So the choice set of network parameters and is even smaller for undirected networks than for directed networks, because tight directionality is not considered at all in undirected networks, right? And in addition, some network parameters on the predetermined list are hard to interpret and lack theoretical foundation. So we often say that our variable choice should be guided by theory, but a lot of like network parameters lack theoretical foundations, but including them can improve model fit or achieve model convergence, right? So it's good to add some like hard to interpret like parameters such as in-near isolates in Siena. And I can tell that the most frequently used parameters for hypothesis testing in communication research, including GWI degree, GWESP, absolute difference or no match. And the network topologies represented by these parameters are interpreted as the mechanisms of, for example, preferential attachment, triadic closure, and homophily respectively. So as I just mentioned, preferential attachment means that people tend to be connected to those who are already popular in the network. So for example, as scholars, we tend to cite articles that are already very popular or are already well cited, right? So triadic disclosure indicates a transitive nature of social type, right? So for example, a friend of mine, my friend should be my friend as well, right? Because this is a balanced network structure. And homophily means that we are connected because we have the same attributes, right? So testing and replicating these three network effects in communication research is important. But my view is that such attempts may not substantially advance network theories themselves, right? So we just approve that these mechanisms apply to the evolution of different types of communication networks, but we don't contribute significantly to building and refining network theories, right? And another challenge of Pitfall is that network models are computationally intensive or even inefficient. So they are very good for analyzing a medium-sized network composed of several hundred nodes, right? So in other words, although we are currently able to collect like big data, including both content and relational data from like social media or other sources, right? Simulation-based network models are not suitable for modeling the evolution of a very large network composed of like millions of nodes or thousands of nodes. So as a result, there is a growing need for bridging this gap, right? So while like large-scale network data are increasingly available in social media space, right? Computational complexity actually limits the sizes of networks for which these models can be estimated. So this is a major limitation and should be addressed by future research. And next issue is the need for like assumption check and triangulations. So simulation-based network models are built on different statistical assumptions, right? So many assumptions are not always checked by researchers. So for example, stochastic actor-oriented models, also known as Siena models, assume a high degree of node agency. So this method is not suitable for analyzing how networks of non-human entities evolve over time because of limited node agency, right? And in addition, we need to avoid tautological model specification, right? So suppose that a researcher use a person's degree centrality or betweenness centrality derived from the observed network as a nodal attribute to predict the evolution of the network. I would say that this modeling strategy is problematic and tautological because we predict the future using observation from the future, right? So we also need to pay attention to the issue of tautological specification. And there's also a growing need for triangulation. So for some network data, there can be more than one legitimate analytical procedure. So for example, I can use stochastic actor-oriented model and the temporal extension of ergon to predict network change across discrete time points. In this case, it would be great if I can show how my empirical results are sensitive to the choice of models with different assumptions. And this research practice is also in line with our recent call for open science in communication research. And network science, the field of network science is constantly evolving, right? And many emerging network measures and methods can inform communication research, right? So for example, a group of scholars from Europe and MIT have created a new metric called entanglement. So entanglement is a physics concept. It has been like used to like measure the synchronization of online communication behavior of team members and their flow state over time. And the second method here combines like a log linear model with exponential random graph modeling to analyze interdependent mobility system as weighted networks, right? So basically, this method takes into account network self-loops, and other type characteristics that represent individual attributes of mobile people, or we can say the resource flow between different geographic location, right? So this method can enable communication scholars to better theorize the concept of mobility in the network society, right? And third, we can see one example of relational hyper-event model. So this model can test network effects that explain the propensity of a group of actors to co-attend a lot of events, right? So basically, communication scholars can use this method to build and test theories of interpersonal, group, and organizational communication and their dynamics. And there are also some advances in Bayesian extensions of autologistic attribute models and the multi-level SAOMs, right? So for example, here is a brief overview of Bayesian autologistic actor attribute models. So here we can see two different types of nodes. So adopted node represents an ego for which the probability of adopting the behavior is predicted. While a solid node represents an author who has already adopted a behavior, right? So we can see from the first two structural configurations, right? So they are examples of simple contagion, or we can say contagion through direct ties, right? My behavior is affected by my direct contact. And the value of Bayesian LAAAM is that we can directly test whether reciprocal or indirect contagion is present in social networks, right? So in reciprocal contagion, I'm affected by the behavior of those who exchange idea with me, right? So you can see a reciprocal tie here, right? And with regard to indirect contagion, the two graphs on the bottom left show contagion through structural holes, right? So basically, I know from my direct contact that another person has adopted a certain behavior. As a result, I will adopt the same behavior as the third party. So this is the interpretation. And the two graphs on the bottom right show contagion through structural equivalence, right? So structurally equivalent people may not be directly connected, but they have similar patterns of incoming or outgoing ties. So in this case, behavior can spread without a direct tie, because structurally equivalent people can serve as a reference point for social comparison. So the emergence of a lot of new methods can enable communication scholars to like build and refine and extend existing communication theories, right? So there are a lot of opportunities in this field. But my observation is that most new network measures and advanced network modeling techniques are developed by like mathematicians, statisticians, computer scientists, data scientists, and like a lot of like social science methodologists. So I put a question mark here on my slide because it seems that communication scholars have played a limited role in developing these like computational network methodologies, right? So what communication scholars often do is to introduce new measures and methods to the communication field and then apply them to analyze communication phenomena, right? So I would say reducing such knowledge asymmetry is important and can make some like methodological contributions to the communication literature. But what is largely overlooked is the role of communication scholars as like theorists in computational social science, right? So basically we can take advantage of network methodologies to build, refine, and extend communication theories. And theoretical contributions, I would say, can be more important and more valuable than simply introducing these methodologies or measures to the field of communication, right? So the last part of my talk will focus on how to leverage theory-driven communication network research, which highlights the importance of communication scholars as like theorists, right? Okay. So my research program focuses on ecological dynamics of communication processes, right? So Albert Rogers wrote a book called entitled History of Communication, right? Many years ago. And in this book, he argued that the emergence of the communication discipline was informed by Charles Darwin and his ecological and evolutionary thinking, right? But ecology has long been treated as a metaphor in communication, right? And this metaphor has been, for example, interpreted as pervasive media environments that surround individuals, or as like organizational species that form different types of relationships in the same media ecosystem, right? And network analysis is a useful and appropriate tool to model the process of ecological interdependence and change, right? So in biology, ecological theory focuses on how interdependent relations between different species and within the same species in a common resource space change over time, right? And many ecological dynamics can be examined through network analytics, right? So species can be represented as nodes. The common resource space can be conceptualized at the network boundary, and the evolution of network different types of cooperative and competitive relations between species can be understood as the evolution of network ties, right? So for example, my previous research has proposed an ecological framework to understand the hiring decision of PhD granting institutions in communication, right? So I conceptualized the job market as an ecosystem in which universities rely on the same set of resources for survival, build and maintain interdependent relations with each other through job hiring and placement, right? So this is a visualization of the observed network. So you can see some direct lines. They show the flow of faculty hiring ties between different universities. And tie receivers hired graduates from tie centers. And line thickness is proportional to tie strength or tie weight, which is the total number of graduates placed in a given university, right? So in this example, a high out degree means that a node placed graduates in many other universities that offer communication programs. So for example, UT Austin has the highest placement capacity. So in other words, graduates of UT Austin were placed in many other American universities. And also a high in degree means that a node hired graduates from many other universities, right? So basically, tie receivers hired graduates from tie centers, right? So I use ergon to examine the formation mechanism of the ecosystem of the communication job market, right? So my results provided evidence for 3 ecological mechanisms, like including structural inertia, niche width, and niche overlap. And they are all ecological constructs, right? So first, I show the persistent nature of faculty hiring ties. And the presence of previous ties, especially good fit ties, will predict the formation of subsequent ties because experience with existing partners produces trust, reduces search costs, and avoid unpredictability, right? And the second finding is that generalists offering more research specialization will be less likely to hire PhD holders within the network boundary than specialists offering like fewer research specialization. This is because generalist organizations tend to deem atypical or unconventional practices as less risky than specialists. And finally, the mechanism of niche overlap was also supported, right? So this ecological construct indicates the level of shared research specialization between universities. And my research results show that niche overlap is positively related to the propensity or probability that a university will hire another university's graduate, right? So suggesting the mutualistic interdependence between organizations in the ecosystem of the job market, right? And due to time limit, I will briefly talk my second study. So in this example, I examine the evolution of audience overlap in the messaging platform ecosystem, right? So there is a long tradition of research on media substitution, right? So there are 2 competing views, displacement and complementarity, right? So guided by these theories, I analyzed audience overlap data as dynamic network data and try to answer the question of whether time spent on one messaging app will explain the formation or persistence of audience overlap with another messaging app, right? So I use I analyze audience overlap as network data. So basically, audience overlap network of messaging apps is derived from a 2-mode network between messaging apps and users, right? So I obtain unobtrusive behavioral tracking data on app use from a commercial company. So due to privacy concerns or policies, and the company has already aggregated individual information. So many individual level attributes such as age, education, ethnicity, income are unavailable to me. But one unique advantage of this digital trace data is that the same user's app use across computer and mobile devices is considered at the aggregate level, so which provides an unduplicated view of cross-platform audience behavior, right? So I use the temporal extension of ergon to investigate the network dynamics of audience overlap. So the results show that time spent with a messaging app is not a significant predictor of audience overlap with other messaging apps, right? So one key takeaway is that media substitution does not occur between apps in the same category, in this case, messaging apps, after I have controlled both network self-organization properties and other app level attributes, right? So what are next steps? What are next steps for developing and building theories of communication ecology and media substitution, right? So I think the next step can be to test whether within species interdependence exists in other categories, including social or news apps. Also, we can test whether media substitution occurs between apps in different categories, right? So this is So the first point is within species interdependence. And the second point is between species interdependence, right? So that we can identify boundary conditions for media substitution in the current app ecology. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions after the second talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Xu, for the very interesting and also informative talk. Okay, so our second panelist is Dr. Jin Song, who is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Communication, Yonsei University. So his research interests including the statistical analysis of communication network data, simulation inferences, and the role of interpersonal political discussion networks and their effect on political behavior. Okay, so Dr. Song, you can start if you are ready.
Okay, so let's see whether I can share the slides. Okay, so change screen. So hopefully you can see my slides, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Okay, so yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm really honored to be here and see a lot of famous faces, including Jonathan and whatnot. So my talk today would be something about networks as well. And I think Dr. Xu already kind of nicely outlined the many of the things that I also share with the status of the discipline. So my talk will be just focusing more on the kind of big picture questions when we trying to use the computational approaches in communication behavior, especially concerning the social networks. So just briefly introducing myself again, my name is Jin. I graduated from the Ohio State University in 2015. And this is kind of things that I work on routinely, including the communication networks within the framework of political engagements. And I also do some substantive things like the dual attitude models and metacognitions and selective and incidental exposure kind of stuff. So today, of course, I'll talk about a little bit about this methodological approaches. But again, at the end of the talk, I hope I will kind of prime everyone about what the opportunities are there and what we potentially missing by relying on these approaches. So just start off, yeah, the agenda. I mean, you can read it here, so I'll just move on. To start off, I think this picture really nicely sums up the kind of the excitements as well as the worries surrounding all the developments that is happening right now, right? So my research kind of looking at how the digital networks affects the process of democratic politics. And we all know that many of the social networks, social media plays a significant role in this process, right? So, I mean, the Facebook or Twitter is perhaps the most frequent platform on which people and as well as politicians directly interact with each other and informed about what is going on in politics, right? They also serve some kind of drivers or the platforms on which people go on the street and do some collective behaviors. Like I assume that many of you are somewhat familiar about what was happened during the past few years in Hong Kong. And during that events, the social media and the digital social networks really played a huge role in motivating as well as recruiting people and disseminating the relevant information to the rest of the world, right? So I think these kind of the phenomena really highlight some of the few things that I see as very important as the study of the social networks in a digital world. So yeah, so basically the digital social networks represents a ubiquitous permanent source of interdependencies among individuals' attitudes and actions, right? So as the Dr. Xu already have kind of mentioned before, we can kind of theorize those interdependencies in a theoretically informed manner and test those assumptions in a variety of different ways, right? But not only about this theoretical importance, what I think is equally important is that these digital social networks serves as a new source of data to precisely observe and document these interdependencies in a granular details, right? So without those digital social networks, we kind of have a limited access to those data, right? So, and traditionally that was the kind of number one, the inhibition factor that people do not take into account those complex interdependencies because there was no data to look at these kind of phenomena, right? But with the help of these digital social networks, we now have abundance of those data, and we now have the ability to observe and document these behaviors, right? So along those lines, my research has looking at precisely these some set of core questions: how to utilize these new data measures or the method to making sense of citizens' political interactions and its consequences in a kind of theoretically informed way, right? So with this aim, my general research programs looking at the complex interdependencies between macro level social context, mainly the information environments, and how that information environments affects people's perceptions and attitudes and behaviors, and typically in a form of social networks, and how that the behaviors of the individuals feed back to the emergence of the social context as well. So yeah, these are some of the works that I have conducted in the past few years, looking at a variety of different angles within which this brought the paradigm. But excuse me. But for today's talk, I'll just briefly introduce two studies that I have conducted in the past to just exemplify what can we do with this kind of the method and data, and also I just start from there to just think about the future challenges as well as opportunities. So first, what do citizens see and discuss online? All right. So this work was appeared in communication research back in, I think, 2018 or so. And with this paper, we were specifically interested in whether people choose to see politically like-minded messages online, like the classical notion of political homophily, right? But the way that we kind of approached this to this political homophily before was either just scraping everything from the web and see whether there is a visible patterns like this, right? So we're just looking at the posting behaviors of the people, right? So if this person is, let's say, a Republican, and all the Republican folks are just commenting each other and not engaging with the other side of the parties, then we tend to interpret this as the evidence of political homophily, right? Which is great, right? It says a lot about how people interact with in online, right? But if you step back for a moment and think about for a second, this is not the whole picture that is really happening, right? So, I mean, what I mean by that is that we are just entirely missing out the reading behaviors of the people, right? By relying on what is already there, in a typical like textual data, we do have the ability to see the documented interactions online, right? But When someone is just reading and just go without leaving any kind of textual traces, we don't have that data, right? So that's the kind of the one chief limitations of the what I think is the traditional approaches of the political selective exposure. We kind of meaning that me and co-workers were not happy about this general tendency. So we came up with this nice framework of looking at how we can actually see people's exposure behaviors in a digital realm. So we used a nationally representative panel data with creating what is called the nascent networks, just creating the network from the scratch and using the online access data to look at the both posting behaviors and the reading behaviors, because this is a selective exposure, not selective engagements, right? So how I do that? So basically, what is this? This is what has happened. So we created just a pure website, like the any other social networks. I mean, this was very rudimentary form of like the discussion board thing, like the BBS platform thing. So this is not really a social networks, but we just take this as kind of another platform within the context of 2012 presidential election back in the days in South Korea. And this is how the data collection has worked. So suppose this is me, although I do not have a beard. So, I mean, believe me, this is me. Suppose that me reading a Dr. Vincent's post in this platform, right? So the Vincent wrote a very nice, the thoughtful, the blogs or whatnot on this platform. So I just choose to read his entries, right? Then what happens from the server side is that we have the information about who posted something on what time and who read that message precisely, right? So, and this is basically just any other the digital access log data that you can find in any of the social media platforms, which is unfortunate because many of them are proprietary, so we don't have the access to those log data, right? So that's why we just created a custom platform for ourselves to get that data. And with that data, we were able to reconstruct people's exposure relationships, like who clicked to view someone else's post or the comments. So we have the whole networks that represents these digital interactions that is undocumented by looking at what is already there, meaning the pure textual post. And alongside with that, we have fielded a three-way panel survey, which asks a lot of different individual attributes like their political identifications and their personality traits. So we ended up having a little over 340 participants with 180,000 time-stamped exposure incidents as documented with the log data. So with data, we did a temporal exponential random graph model thing, which I think that, Dr. Zhu already talked about. So I'll just skip for what the methodological details, but I'm happy to answer any questions if you have some specific remarks on them. Here comes the results. So let's just directly look at what we have found. So we have a variety of different model specifications representing the three different levels that the doctors already talked about, like the nodal attributes, the dyadic level, homophily, as well as the structural predictors in the model. But what I think is interesting is these specific three homophily terms that testing the political homophily hypothesis. So this is specified as a dyadic level homophily. So whether they have the same, they meaning the samples in our survey has the same, the preference for the presidential candidates, or they have the similar policy preferences. So if they are similar on that profile, then they are represented with the high values in these two homophily terms. But as you can see, their 95% confidence intervals do overlap with 0, meaning that preference homophily doesn't really explain whether people choose and click to see someone else's message in those online platforms, which speaks directly against the political homophily perspectives. We have one significant result, what is called evaluative criteria homophily. And I think this is a very interesting term because it represents the homophily in terms of the judgmental standard on which people evaluate political figures. This is interesting because the similarity in this criteria doesn't necessarily mean that they have the similar attitude, right? So we can evaluate the political figures on a very same basis, but that base doesn't really mean that we have the similar attitudes, right? So we can evaluate the one figure, let's say their economic preferences or the economic consequences of the country, but we can end up having very different evaluations, right? So I think this really speaks to the possibility where people have a high chance of exposure to the difference because someone else's perspectives may be useful for them, but not necessarily exactly the same as theirs, right? So just summing up, the question of whether people choose to see politically like-minded peers' message, the answer was clear no, right? So the traditional notion of political homophily wasn't really able to explain people's message selection behaviors, right? But voters, as in the sample, were more likely to select the messages that is potentially informative to them, not necessarily whether they have the same political preferences or not, right? So I think this kind of nicely speaks to the new exciting possibilities where we can leverage the digital trace data coupled with the network approaches to substantively answer the questions that we as a communication scientist care about, right? Okay, so the second study, the macro level consequences. You just have saw the people's exposure relationship, whether people choose to see like-minded people's message or not, and the answer was no. All right, but then the natural question arises, right? So what are the end outcomes, not only in terms of individuals' attitudes and behaviors, but as a kind of societal outcomes, right? What are the system level consequences of these discussion dynamics? Right, so in this article, which was published in Journal of Communication in 2017, we were interested in whether the societal level polarization, which is often thought of the result of selective exposure tendencies, can be explained by interpersonal discussion dynamics. So we tested this kind of very complicated so-called mutually reinforcing spider model in this paper. But our aim was explicitly testing whether we can explain the variations in terms of the attitudinal distributions of the society when we tweak the people's tendency to seek out politically like-minded message. With this, we developed the agent-based model coupled with some rudimentary network dynamics. I mean, this is not a fully fledged simulation models as the stochastic actor-oriented models or temporal exponential random graph models, but just pure ABM models. So we created a artificial society consists of 2,500 agents, represents each of the individuals, which has initial attitudes from -3 to +3 that represents any kind of political attitudes abstractly. In this setting, agents interact with the other agents. So this is where that the interpersonal dynamics or the selection dynamics kicks in. And they also consume some pro and counterattitudinal media exposure at each time point. We model opinion dynamics as a result of these three things. We simulate number of scenarios, this is what really happens. Just for the sake of time, I just kind of just rushing through the ends. So apologize for that. We tested a number of different models in this paper, but in first model, we posit there is no interpersonal network dynamics present, meaning that people do not have the selective exposure tendencies, as in the first paper that you just saw. So if we assume that, then this is what happens over time. So people just continuously changing their attitudes to some degree, but we really do not see any kind of emergent patterns going on as a result of those dynamics. But once we consider that interpersonal dynamics, the network dynamics, meaning that people have some tendencies to self-select with those who have similar political preferences, then this is what happens. So we now have clear consequences in terms of the distribution of the opinions at the societal level, right? And this is how that the various indices of political polarizations changes over time. You can see that there's a clear difference in terms of these emergent properties of the system when we consider the interpersonal network dynamics at the individual level, right? So again, I think this is very nice applications of looking at what computational models in general, or specifically the network dynamics can do, and further inform the developments of theories, because we can test a variety of different assumptions that is not afforded by the real world data. Because I mean, we cannot tweak and do some real experiments with the real people, right? That's the clearly no. And I'll get back to this point. Okay, so opportunities, challenges, and pitfalls. I mean, this is where I want to talk about most, and this is where I really get excited about. Well, okay, so we already have seen these kind of settings before, right? But one thing that we can do more is that we can not only look at the people's interaction patterns, but also we can model that interaction patterns in conjunction with the topical informations or the textual data that we can scrape from online, right? So I assume most of you are somewhat familiar with the concept of topic modeling, right? So, and the beauty of topic model is that we can just scrape anything and then see what is there without assuming the prior knowledge of the researchers, right? So by linking those content data with the network dynamics, we can really answer the questions like how political discussion topics dynamically emerge and evolve over time, kind of situations, right? And this also has some theoretical significance as well, because that really, as the principled approach, in my opinion, looking at the citizen deliberations, patterns, and the contents at the same time as well, right? We can also think about a variety of different extensions of this framework. So for example, we can also scrape the content data from like the major newspapers or any other the informations that people routinely encounter, and see whether that same information somehow translated to where people discuss things online, right? So basically, tracing the origins, the evolutions, and diffusion of political contents from one source to another source, right? So this would be meaning that we are looking at the effects of media and elite discourses on topics of citizens' political interactions, which has, I think, a significant theoretical importance as well, right? But also, methodologically speaking, this is interesting because we can really combine different approaches like social networks, topic models, and whatnot, right? We can also think about some creative ways in which we can devise so-called digital experiments, right? So what are the consequences of citizens discussing online by just really doing some network level experiments, right? So here, this is very rudimentary idea, but I'm sure that you, some of you may have some similar thoughts on this, but here's what happens. So basically, we recruit different groups as a networks, right? So we administer a group level experiments, and for some groups, they are assigned to, let's say, a deliberative conditions, or in other groups they are assigned to information only condition, and some groups just serving as a true control conditions. All of them are going through some baseline surveys, and for the deliberation and information only conditions, we send out some information about, let's say, some political topic, right? And see whether people naturally discuss that information within a natural social environments. And later on, we can devise some external shocks, like the events that is happening on only among the subset of the people in the networks, right? So let's say we invite some people to the online town hall meeting with the political figures, and see whether that experience of the interactions spreads to the rest of the networks, and how that makes the difference in terms of people understand the politics and developing some political attitudes over time, right? So doing some follow-up surveys, right? Along this line, we hear nowadays a lot of the terms like the infodemics and the misinformation propagation, right? So this is also, I think, where the computational models in general and the network dynamics plays a significant roles, right? So maybe this is also rudimentary thoughts. We can devise some digital experiments, right? So just randomly making people to interact with someone else in a controlled environment. And we combine that with the agent-based simulations with the epidemic dynamics, and that would inform us about how the misinformation really propagates in the system by looking at different patterns of the interactions, and see whether that patterns changes, then the propagation dynamics changes over time, kind of thing, right? So I think this is all the exciting opportunities we as a communication researchers could think of in terms of utilizing the power of computational models in general and network models in particular. But I mean, it comes with a variety of different challenges, right? And I assume that most of you would somewhat familiar that a notorious emotional contagion paper that was published like a few years ago back, right? So the Facebook did a real experiment with the real people without informing the people, basically, right? So there is a huge ethical issues and privacies, but not only about these issues, using the trace or big data comes with a variety of different challenges. One thing is that's we often thought that the trace data is objective indicators of people's behaviors, but processing and analyzing those data entails quite many subjective and arbitrary steps. We all know that we can play a huge degree of freedom game when we cleaning up the data, right? And because there's a data means that this is not a better data, right? So, I mean, clearly these, the new source of data represents some segments of the people, not all people, nor it doesn't necessarily mean that this is the most appropriate set of people to study, right? And sometimes that issue is exacerbated because the data that we get from these proprietary platforms has a unknown, like the black box thing, like sample selection criteria, when we rely on, let's say, the API to extract some of the data points, right? Well, these issues themselves are not a problem, I think, per its own, but typically there is a huge issue about the data access. And this is the increase, this is the one area that I see the increasing and worrying tendencies over time. We love to share the data, but somehow these computational scientists are very reluctant to share the data with others. I mean, yeah, you know what's going on, right? So if the researchers don't share the data, I mean, others cannot verify it, but we just love to not share the data, right? So that's the problem. And it kind of reflects the structural and more huge issues behind the data game in computational age. This is one of the remarks made by Dean Flinlon back in, I think, 2018 or so, that computational research in the post-API age, saying that we're passing the era of what is called post-API age, right? The data access is significantly limited by the proprietary platforms. And I think this little cartoon is kind of nicely sum up of what is really happening frequently in a real data acquisition thing in academia, right? So we want to study something, right? But we kind of naturally bounded to the question where we can answer the question with the available data, right? We cannot answer the question if there's no data to answer that, right? So therefore, for example, we see a lot of academic publications that utilize Twitter specifically because the Twitter is a #1 platform that affords those kind of data acquisition by the API, right? Facebook shut down its API, so there's no way we can get the data without violating their the terms of service, right? There's a huge gray areas because there is like the GDPR or some differential privacy laws across countries. So researchers are just kind of not sure how to do that, right? The one potential solution is doing a platform collaborations, right? So just team up with someone who is working at Facebook, team up with someone who is working in Twitter, right? But that is not really an ideal solution either because there's different like these issues that limits the ideal data collection scenarios, right? So, and just for the sake of time, just concluding our thoughts. Yeah, you all know that the Elon Musk recently fulfilled one of the wishes back in the past, right? So, and I think this really marks another age of the so-called glimmer future. We're now seeing that there's increasing dependency on proprietary platforms to study people's behaviors, right? So there's perhaps the most two important the platforms on which people enjoy their digital life is like the Meta, the Facebook, Instagrams, and those kind of platforms, and the other was Twitter. And now both of those platforms are on the hands of the rich guys that reluctant to share what is happening on those platforms, right? And I think this exemplifies the broader the structural issues of the unequal data access or the data acquisition among academic communities, because some lucky people get to know someone who is working on those platforms and have the huge advantage, but sometimes not, right? And we all know that that's not good for the science, right? We are somewhat familiar with the principles of the openness in science, but I think that's where we as a community needs to struggle in terms of creating a more open and accessible data acquisition framework in order to continue to exciting things by these computational things. Okay, so my talk ends here, and like I said, thanks for having me with this wonderful panel, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for Dr. Song for putting me in the scenario. Okay, so now we open the floor for questions and comments. Okay, so you can directly raise your hand if you have any question. Okay, Jonathan, you can directly.
I really don't plan to ask questions because I think that we have so many participants who are curious and to learn more from the speakers. Since perhaps some of them are still framing their questions, so let me just throw out a kind of question. It's not a question, just ask each of you to give one, the most kind of representative or most kind of surprising, unexpected study using network analysis to approach communication problems. Of course, in addition to your own works, you have demonstrated enough. Just try to see that you are the kind of the role model, the most successful case to tell people from other disciplines, the communication scholars, do creative, original, or provocative network analysis.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, you can go first. Yeah.
No, you go first. I need some seconds to think. So.
Okay, so I see some cases using communication. So I have read some articles. It actually examines some communication phenomena, but it was not conducted by communication scholars. So basically, so it's a combination of like content or textual data as well as network data. So this paper was just published like several days ago in management science. So researchers from MIT combine both like LDA and dynamic network analysis. So basically they collect data on employee communication, email communication. So sample size about several hundred employees in an organization. And they observe their longitudinal changes in communication like patterns as well as content over time, right? So they build a theory of novelty. So novelty communication. So basically novelty can convey many different ideas. So including the information itself is non-redundant, or information is diverse, or information itself is unique, right? So novelty is actually an ambiguous term in communication or creativity research, right? So our traditional view of network evolution is that strong ties or cohesive strong ties provide homogeneous information. So translate into a lack of novelty, while weak and bridging ties provide like novel information, because weak bridging ties can connect you to people from different social circles. So this is our traditional way of thinking, right? So this study actually challenges this assumption using communication data from about, I remember about like 2 million email threads over an extended period of time, right? So they use like LDA to classify like email communication content to different categories. And they validate this method using another text mining technique. So they actually conceptualize, they measure non-redundancy, information redundancy as or inverse cosine similarity between different content categories. And also they use like standard deviation or whatever, I forgot. So, or the Thompson's like diversity index to measure information diversity, right? And they also use like entropy measure. So the entropy is a classical concept in communication as well. They use entropy measure to measure the level of overlap between information at time 1 and information at time 2. So the conclusion, the findings show that actually strong and cohesive ties actually can provide non-redundant or diverse information, while weak and bridging ties can provide unique information or increase the level of uniqueness. So this research actually contributes to communication by clarifying the role of novelty, and as well as the relationship between and the co-evolution of communication patterns and network structure. So make theoretical contributions to both network and communication science. So I think this is a great paper, and which has many theoretical implications for the communication business and also digital and also computational social science.
Yeah, I think Winston Penn has recommended the article to some of to my research group, but I haven't got time to read it. Yeah, I think this is it certainly qualifies the kind of role model that I was asking for. Thank you very much.
Yep, I just wanted going to say the same thing. So generally, like including the one that Dr. Xiu also mentioned, there are some exciting applications that combining the textual data and the network dynamics. And I also see a lot of different like statistical, the newer statistical framework and whatnots are developing, and that's one of the very exciting areas that we should keep attention to. Also, I think I don't know, this might be a bias, but I think one of the key strengths of we as a communications scholars is the knowledge about how the text works, right? So so anything related to like the LDA applications or some the simulation-based inferences could be the things that I think the most representative and the role model kind of thing that we need to pay attention to. There is one paper that I really like that's authored by the Annie Walther, who is now at the University of Vienna. I mean, she is the division chair of the computational division in ICA. She published some papers back in, I think, 2017 or so, using simulation models to study the core communication theories from a simulation framework. So, I mean, this is not exactly a network per se, but I think that is kind of one of the role models that we can take the existing method and then apply to some substantive communication theories. And I think this is important because I see two different trends in computational communities, especially in communication. So the one I would say a pack is like applying the existing method to a communication questions. And the other is trying to develop a new statistical framework and method and whatnot. I think both are important, but quite frankly speaking, we are not computer scientists. We are not typically, we're not computer scientists. We're not statisticians. So I think quite honestly, there's no way we can beat those folks and like coming up with very like the state-of-the-art imputation, the estimation models and whatnot, right? So we as a social scientist and communication scientist could do well is to actually applying that thing and answer the questions that we care about. And we are in a better position to do that precisely and effectively, right? So I think personally, that's the way that we should go. But I mean, yeah, that's my opinion. So
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Any other questions from the participants?
I can ask a question. Sorry, I couldn't find where actually I raised my hand, but I mean just more a comment or discussion rather than a specific question, because I don't really do network analysis, but I've used Argom to analyze some like small scale trigger data set. And coming from a more traditional, persuasion, media effects type of training, I'm always trying to figure out how, theory-driven models mean differently or the same, right? I'm just more asking, from the more traditional message testing paradigm versus the social network paradigm. In terms of, for my understanding, it could be wrong and very limited, of Argom and this type of analysis it's more retrospective sort of model generation, building, fitting. You can test some of the theoretical explanations, but it's like network self-organization. It's kind of factors that is inherent to the networks. There are only these many parameters you can test, and then the actor attributes and stuff like that. It's quite limited to the data, right? As both of you, acknowledged and talked about. You do look under the light, so it's quite constrained. So it's, just from a very traditional sort of theory testing, message testing perspective, I just feel like it's kind of different from, you have a hypothesis and then you collect data to kind of disconfirm the hypothesis in the more traditional falsification science sense of doing hypothesis testing. So but I think that for network analysis, it reveals a lot, right? Insights, and it's very nice to see, and also it's connected to real data instead of like fake college student in the lab data. So I think it has a lot to contribute, but I'm still trying to make that connection between how do we use network data or the network data in terms of doing theory-driven testing or theory-driven analysis or theory-driven research? Is it mostly still more backward-looking instead of, I don't know whether I'm characterizing it correctly, but I think, Dr. Song talked a lot about these new ideas, and it's very exciting, and setting up experiments to do these sort of things. So I'm probably just asking for your sort of thoughts, like for someone like me who is interested in the network perspective and who sees a lot of, value and insights, importance in that. But if we are to combine or connect that to the traditional theory-based, or in my very traditional understanding of comm research or comm processes, how do we make this sort of bridge between these two sets of research? So just more, I'm more interested in your thoughts and insights on this. So thanks.
Okay, so Thanks for the great comments. You're asking very hard questions in the disguise of the comments, so that's nice. I mean, you're not wrong. I think you got it right. The compared to a traditional like the message-centric perspective, so I would say network, all the network method that we have talked about is very agnostic about the actual contents. We're not from a network scientist perspective, message is just message. Like there's just anything that people can be connected with each other, so we can make a network out of it. That's it. The message's role ends there, right? But from a traditional comp science perspective, that's not where we are really satisfied, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do, and I also personally struggle with connecting that these two different disciplines. I would say one thing that we can looking at is whether so basically like switching the roles with each other. So from a traditional perspective, we can kind of think about a variety of different scenarios, which kind of persuasive messages works best, and we whatnot, make it inform the theoretical predictions. And then maybe we can test that idea with the network as a dependent variable, right? So when we show some messages to the people, then whether that message travels to some predictable patterns and whatnot, right? So that's the one thing. And the other thing is just switching the tails and the head. So we can kind of looking at how the people's interactions or the network structures shapes, for example, from my research example, how that shapes people's messages to the other people kind of thing, right? So reception as well as the sending dynamics. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things to do, and I think yeah, basically we should do more research, basically. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so a few additional comments. So basically the scope of research questions is limited by the existing methods. So as for like ergoms, we need to include both like network self-organizing properties and nodal attributes, right? So, but as you may know, right? So we replicate many findings of preferential attachment, triadic closure, and there's nothing new about it because network self-organizing properties are driven by a lot of theories of networks, including preferential attachment, transitivity, and also structural equivalence, structural holes, right? So and also the ergom itself has been criticized a lot because like the traditional ergom does not consider timestamp. And even for longitudinal panel analysis, like temporal separable ergoms or stochastic oriented model, including Sienna, only conduct like discrete time analysis. So basically we collapse like timestamp network data into like several time points. We just observe their changes across time points. And these analytical tools have a lot of limitations as well. So from my theoretical, based on my own understanding, I think there are three like directions. So first, use like model that take into account time strengths and timestamp, including relational event modeling. So in REM, we can test mechanisms of like recency, right? This is also a concept in traditional communication research. Recency, persistence, and also inertia, right? And the next second direction is to consider the multi-level structure, right? So we can have like both like one mode network and also and like two mode network. So the formation of two mode network can be determined by the formation of one mode network, right? And vice versa. So there is a complex structural interdependence between networks at different levels. So this is different from traditional multi-level analysis. In traditional communication research, multi-level means that a unit is nested within another unit. But in network analysis, it means like nodes, right? Or network ties at different levels, right? We can have like network ties between individuals, network ties between objects, and also network ties between individuals and objects, right? So there are many more structural configurations of parameters we can test using multi-level method. And the third direction is the dynamics between network structures and behavior. So we can examine the co-evolution of structure and behavior. And this behavior can also include attitudes and behavioral intention and other psychological variables, right? So which can help us to clarify like the debate on like social contagion versus social selection, right? Social selection means that we are connected because we have a similar like interest, right? And social contagion means that we first establish a network tie, then we form another type of relation. And another direction for theory-driven communication research using network analytics is to consider how we use like nodal attributes as an independent variable, right? So in my study, my research is like informed by ecological and evolutionary theory. So I use many ecological concepts as nodal attributes. In another research, I consider like bot agency in computer media communication. So I use a node or Twitter account's bot probability as a nodal attribute to theorize the process of human and AI interactions or human bot interactions in the current landscape of computer media communication. I believe that there are many interesting directions, and this is a promising field that our communication scholars can make significant theoretical contributions.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So it's also clear some of my computing thought about this area. So because of the time limit, we may don't have time for another round of Q&A. Okay, so if you still have questions, please feel free to send me an email. So we'll transfer to also our panelists. So thank you
so much,
Dr. Song, for bringing us so brilliant this talk. Okay, so hope this is not the end of
certainly I will see many of you at the upcoming ICAs, hopefully. So
yeah, I will be there.
Yeah,
that's great. Okay, so yeah, I think we already take use of them. Okay, thank you for participant.
Thank you. Let's keep the network. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.